Welcome to grade A fun. So I was sitting back planning out this illustration and thinking to myself, like, man, people always be thinking like, man, how do I rock a style? So I decided, yo, I'm gonna make a video that shows how I start with some study and how I end with some style. Oh yeah. The first step is that you got to collect reference. So what I do is I go on the internet because the internet's amazing, right? So if you need pictures, like there's tons of pictures, and then I import it. In this case, I'm using Toon because it's my favorite software to draw in. Just because I like the drawing tools. The drawing tools are nice, and I'm just tracing over it. Well, it's like informed tracing, meaning that I'm looking for things that like details, shapes that I know that I want to translate later, and they're analytical things. So I'm looking at these just shapes that I know are going to be potentially useful, right? So my first pass is purely let me find these big broad shapes that are going to be essential to manipulate and change the shape of things. So my next pass is I'm about to start putting some style on it. And this next pass still has a lot of the details from the earlier drawings. So it still has some of the shape of the eyes. It still has some shape of the mouth, the nose area. It still has a lot of the whisker detail, even the actual mouth shape. The body still does have a lot of the detail, the shape proportion, a lot of the bumps from the anatomy of the animal, or the cat. Duh. Then I start playing with the shapes a little more. So you can see that instead of the tapered head shape, that it's much more circular, much more round. So I'm trying just little by little to make departure from the structure that was in my first drawing, and also the proportion. So you can see that the head gets bigger, is growing. The body proportion is still kind of leaning towards realism. And in these next studies, there's a lot less. There's actually no copying. So I'm not drawing over the picture anymore. I'm using my original drawing as interpretation, right? So I know the feel of the bumps and the shapes that I want to hit. So I don't have to copy anymore. So in my last version, or at least in this one, two, three, four, the fourth version, like there's even greater departure in terms of like playing with the shapes, manipulating things. The shape of the head becomes a lot more general. The mouth shape, and eventually I kind of settle on like I like the proportions of this. And it's purely just an intuitive thing. There's nothing specifically that I would say that's like that's it. It's just an intuitive thing. Like I think to myself, I like how big the head is. It kind of breaks from the specifics of the original anatomical structures and even just the overall proportion. And I did another study. I did one laying down because that's something that I need for this whole like idea later. So I played around with some sketches from that, but I mean it was kind of fruitless, and it wasn't really the direction that I wanted to go. And the style of the body and how everything was kind of mashed up, I thought to myself, like, man, that's not gonna work. And but I'm leaving it in here so you can see that I use the same, at least the same shape of the head, and apply that to another drawing and playing with the same idea. But ultimately, I decided, you know what, I want to try to see where I could take this stylistically. And so you may be asking, like, and you see, I made the head even bigger. Wow. And then even bigger. Wow. And so you may be asking, like, why red? That just stood out. Sometimes I use blue, and a lot of times I use blue just because it's a old school animation thing. You know, back in the day, they used the blue and the red to indicate that, hey, this is the blue line, this is the original drawing that's eventually potentially going to be inked over, and then this is the red line that's corrections. But in this case, I just like to use colors to differentiate the different phases. So the next step is really I'm about to clean it up. And the cleanup part of this is just long and laborious, to be quite honest. There's a lot of like redrawing things. Oftentimes I try to hit the lines like the first time. Like that's a for like these cartooning kind of things. I like to try to hit the line. And if I don't hit the line, I just undo it. Like if I don't hit that line like I want to, I'm like, nah, that ain't gonna work. And it's not something you have to do, especially it's not something you have to do in Toon Boom. But it's something that I like to do because I want to really get a specific line. And you can see in the cleanup process, originally I put my scribble layer on the color layer inside the line. I mean the color layer inside that one layer, and then I'll go back in and draw on the line layer, and then after that I'll go back to the color layer and I delete out my scribbles because I don't want to keep them, and I don't want to make a new layer just for scribbles. But I mean that's just my process. You can do it however you want. And so at this point, I'm just going through and I'm making layers. I'm making palettes for each color for each part of the cat because that's how the coloring system in Toon Boom works. Like you have to make a unique swatch, not a unique palette. I'm sorry, man, my terminology's checked up. You have to make a unique swatch for every color that you want to use, and some people don't like that. They get frustrated by it because they just want to select a color and scribble away. But oftentimes, like I already kind of have an idea in mind of the colors I want to use, so it's not a thing. And plus, the awesome part of it is that if you change your mind, like you could change the colors really quickly, which is pretty awesome. So at this point, I'm just going in and putting in shadow. And the way I typically like to work with both my shadow and light, I like to make a new layer, and it means that I have more control over where I place shadow, and I don't have to use a lot of specific colors to make the shadow for like the underside, where the lighter part of the underside of the chin, and or the little stripes on the head or the stripes on the body. So if you do it to where you are manually making the colors for each one of those, then it becomes a lot more difficult. So the way I'll rock this is that I'll go into my node editor and I make a blend node for this shadow layer. So what that means is that I can do you would do it in Photoshop, right? Where you can go through different blend modes for each layer to effectively get a different look. It's the same exact process. Oh, it's the same exact idea, but the process is a little bit different. So I'm gonna do the same thing for just the sort of imaginary light. And I mean the light source is logical, meaning that it's coming from a certain angle, certain direction. I mean there's area where I'll add like light shapes that I feel like I want definition, and then there's areas that I'll just omit. I mean there's logic to it. It's not absolutely accurate, but because it's cartoon and it's stylistic, like you do have some latitude to kind of play with where the light technically falls, and that you don't have to really realistically hit like the core shadow and all those really specific areas that are involved in like quote unquote light and value placement. But I did go in and I put in a radio blur because I wanted to soften it because it felt a little bit too hard. At least in that light side. Like the shadow side, I didn't really mind it as much. But in that light side, I just wanted to soften the shape. And then one thing I'll often do is with any of the light and shadow shapes, what I'll do is I'll go and I'll flatten them. And you can see they don't have any more extra strokes in them. And that's only because sometimes when you have extra strokes and the strokes, you can end up with just like these weird overlapping bits, and it doesn't always happen, but sometimes you can see it show up. So I'll go in and I'll just flatten all of it because it's all in one layer and it's all one solid color, and I don't really need all the little extra bits anyway. So and then I'll go on. I made in another highlight layer to do some little areas of where it's highlight, like where it's shiny, just to add that shine, because everybody likes highlights. And then I made another layer that's a much more hard edge highlight, and it's not blurred. And so I got basically a shadow layer. I have a light, which is the yellowish light, and then I have a white light, which makes the little shiny bits, and then I have this highlight for the highlights. Okay, was that too much? Was it was that too far? I don't know. And then I created like this little white outline. It's like a cool calligraphic line thing, just to separate the character from the background. I mean, you could probably add a shadow or something or anything, but I felt like it added like a little impact, you know. But that's it. You know, if you have questions and you're like, yo, how'd you do that stuff? And you want like really specifics, I mean, subscribe to the channel, or you can hit me in the comments and be like, hey man, you was doing some stuff that I didn't really understand. Like, how you do that? It's pretty easy. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I'm doing here is fairly easy. These are very uncomplicated things. The node editor is your friend. I know some people like to stay away from it, but a lot of this stuff is stuff that you do have to do in the node editor. So you do need a version of Harmony that will allow you to go into the node editor. So this last little bit, I just wanted to create a little bit more transition so that you go from light to dark in the lower part of the body. And the cool thing about so much of this though is that you could animate a lot of this stuff. Like you could effectively probably put a deformer, or you could even just cut them out and puppet them if you wanted them to, especially the head, and especially because it's all as separate shapes. So I like this process. It's a quick and fast way of shading things, and it makes it to where it's basically independent parts and pieces. So that's the process. I just wanted to share that with y'all. If you're struggling with style, it starts with study first. Grade A fun. Holla at your boy.